last with you guys, and I want us to think for just a moment as we start how the landscape in America, in Tennessee, even in this region has changed dramatically just in those few years. In areas where we used to see billboards that would maybe advertise a family business, today what we're seeing are billboards that are advertising atheism. This one says, atheism, a personal relationship with reality. We see buses rolling by with signs that say, there's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life. In fact, there's a campaign in Minnesota right now. They're putting up signs that say, please don't indoctrinate me with religion. Teach me to think for myself. And in fact, there are atheists all across our nation who are putting up billboards that say, all religions are fairy tales. Things have changed pretty dramatically, but the underlying message is quite literally still the same, and that is they are trying very, very hard to teach our kids that there is no God. You look, for instance, at the March 2006 issue of Discover magazine. It was a picture of Charles Darwin. The title was Unintelligent Design. And it was in this issue that the authors were basically saying that all life evolved from virus particles. Take a look at what they say. Now there's news for intelligent designers and the rest of us to ponder. We humans and all life on earth may have well evolved from the most unintelligent entities one can imagine. Genetic shards that do nothing but copy themselves. We are nobody's great idea. We are the fortunate mistakes of countless biochemical morons. That's evolution. It's humbling, but somehow comforting. Now, I don't know about you on this very cold January night. I don't find that very comforting. But folks, the reality is, when you really boil it all down, there are only two options. Either we are here by mistake, meaning we're just the fortunate mistakes of countless biochemical morons, just the product of a big bang that happened zillions of years ago, or there really is a God. And you're here for a purpose. You were created in His image. Now, as you look at those two particular options, I want everybody in the room to ask yourself, what is the only legal theory that they're teaching our kids today in the textbooks? You don't have to tell me, because I brought a couple of those textbooks with me. For instance, this one says, humans probably evolved from bacteria that lived more than 4 billion years ago. Or how about this one? We know, for example, that humans evolved from common ancestors we share with other living primates, such as chimpanzees and apes. Over and over and over again, the message is the same. This is a biology book put out by Arms and Camp. It says, by the 7th month, the fetus looks from the outside like a tiny normal baby. But it's not. Now ask yourself, why would we be teaching our young people, first off, that that's not a human child in the womb at 7 months? Because any lady in this room who has ever given birth, they can tell you by 7 months, those children, they're doing aerobics, right? And yet they're wanting our kids to associate all of this to think that there is no value to human life. And you look at me and you say, yeah, Brad, I hear what you're saying, but that doesn't really affect my child, does it? I mean, it doesn't affect our community, and certainly it doesn't affect their religion, right? Well, let's look a little deeper. Let's get a little bit more serious. For instance, this is a textbook used extensively here in the Southeast. I'm a Tennessee boy, so I can pick on us, okay? This is a biology textbook. Chapter is on genetics and evolution. Now, it's got the normal evolutionary dogma that I would come to expect. Very first sentence says, although all living creatures ultimately share a common ancestry, they have come to differ from one another through the process of evolution. Not very surprising. I expect that. But here's what you might not expect. Literally, you turn the page, at the top of the very next page, it says this. The mythology of most peoples includes a story explaining the appearance of humans on earth. The account of creation recorded in Genesis in the Bible, for example, explains human origins. In other words, they're chalking it up as a what? As a myth. In fact, take a look in that same chapter. They've got a picture of the Tower of Babel. Little caption that says, the unfinished Tower of Babel, described in the first book of the Bible, symbolizes an ancient West Asian, there's that word again, myth about the origins of language diversity. Towards the end, it says, for instance, in traditional Christian religions, believers speak of God as a father who had a divine son, but do not entertain thoughts of God as a mother or divine daughter. They go on to say such male privileging religions. And folks, what I need you to understand as we begin is this. It's no longer just about teaching our kids a godless theory. Now they're quite literally attacking their faith. And as you think about the whole idea of such male privileging religion, do you think they would ever say that about Islam? You won't see that in a textbook. And yet it is now open season on Christianity. As you think about that, ask yourself this simple question. If we remove God from the textbooks and now we're starting to basically belittle Christianity, where do we get our sense of right and wrong? Right now in my home congregation, I attend Southern Hills Church of Christ in Franklin, Tennessee. If you're ever in Franklin, Nashville area, come see us. I'm teaching a class on Wednesday nights on ethics because I quite honestly, I feel like sometimes we need to be reminded that as we make decisions in our Christian walk, we don't make them based on situations. We don't make them based on emotion, but rather we make them based on God's Word. But folks, if we take that out of the school system and now we're taking it out of the community, where do we get our sense for right and wrong? Because right now what we got is a problem. Let me share with you just how bad a problem it really is. This is an article that appeared in the Journal of Medical Ethics a couple of months ago, and I'll tell every single one of you, I honestly did not think I would live long enough to see an article like this. It's called, the title of the article was, After Birth Abortion, Why Should the Baby Live? Put out by a couple of scientists. Take a look at what they're suggesting we start doing in our country. They say abortion is largely accepted even for reasons that do not have anything to do with the fetus's health. By showing that, number one, both fetuses and newborns do not have the same moral status as actual persons, and two, the fact that both are potential persons is morally irrelevant. Three, that adoption is not always in the best interest of actual people. The authors argue that what we call after-birth abortion, that is, killing a newborn, should be permissible in all the cases where abortion is, including cases where the newborn is not disabled. In fact, they go on to actually say merely being a human is not in and of itself a reason for ascribing somebody a right to life. Now, in all honesty, that should not surprise too many people in this room. And the reason that I say that is because now for at least 2 generations, we've been teaching kids, you're nothing but an advanced animal. You just evolved over time. And yet, ultimately, what they're doing is they're removing the soul of man. Let me share with you why I would say that. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, we're told that we were made in the image and likeness of God. Now, if I were to ask each and every one of you tonight, what does that mean? What's it mean to be made in the image of God? Does that mean that God's got hands like mine or a face, cute face like mine? No, I think everybody in here knows. The Bible says God is a spirit, right? Those who worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. Okay, if God is a spirit, then what part of Brad was created in His image and likeness? That would be my spirit, my soul. Folks, ultimately what they are doing is they're turning us into just another animal. They're removing the soul of man. And so they have no problem making a suggestion like the following. Look at how far they're willing to go with this thing. They say the alleged right of individuals such as fetuses and newborns to develop their potentiality, which someone defends, is overridden by the interest of actual people, whether that be parents, family, society, to pursue their own well-being. Because, as we have just argued, merely potential people cannot be harmed by not being brought into existence. Actual people's well-being could be threatened by the new, even if healthy child, requiring energy, money, and care, which the family may be in short supply of. So, in other words, if you don't have enough money, if you don't have enough energy, if you don't have enough time, just kill it, according to them. And yet, again, what does the Bible say? Proverbs chapter 6, starting in verse 16, these 6 things doth the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination unto him. Remember what they are? First one's a proud look, second one's a lying tongue. Number 3, hands that shed what? Innocent blood. And so here we find ourselves in a nation that is doing everything it can to get rid of God, and yet look at where it puts us. We're now doing the very things that he quite literally hates. You say, Brad, we would never do that. Interesting, since our nation is already viewing children as a quote-unquote parasitic burden on society. And you say, but Brad, we would never ever do the whole afterbirth abortion thing. That's interesting because Planned Parenthood is already making videos trying to get support for it. You see, that's where we are today. I'll ask you the question, how do we teach morals and character if we take away God as our standard? Because when you think about it for just a moment, everybody in this room can remember back, those of you who are over the age of, say, 25, 30, you can think back to a time in which things were a lot better morally in America. The good old days. Now, I would throw out TV shows, but I'd probably start dating myself. It's funny, we kind of have generations in this room. I'm looking at some folks who are like, some of you are Andy Griffith people, some of you are Waltons, some of you are Brady Bunch. I have no idea what was before the Waltons, so I just go with me on that. But folks, here's the problem with that. If you're mentally living back in the good old days, you're not preparing your kids for the future. Because let me share with you one thing that I honestly believe is going to happen. Everybody in this room has probably heard a prayer like the following. A man gets up on a Sunday and he says something to the effect of, Lord, we thank you for allowing us to worship here without fear of persecution. You ever heard that? I think that's going to stop probably during my lifetime. In fact, I think it may stop quicker than we think. I believe probably within the next 5 to 8 years, every single church, every nonprofit organization is going to get a list of things that you can't speak out against. That'll be considered a hate speech crime. Things like homosexuality, for instance. And the church is going to have to decide, do we want to keep our nonprofit tax-deductible status, or are we going to be the New Testament church? And I think it's going to continue from there. You see, the reality today is we're not realistically one nation under God anymore, because there's a lot of folks who want to kick God out. You say, Brad, how do you know that? Take a look. I grabbed this off of a website, Targeting Our Kids. It's from humanists and atheists who say, the website is called Kids Without God, You're Not the Only One. It's a website that quite literally is encouraging kids to come, play games, make artwork, videos, all while giving up their quote-unquote foolish religious beliefs. Or how about this one? A couple of short months ago, professor, Florida Atlantic University, had the students to write the word Jesus on a piece of paper, put the piece of paper on the ground, and then step on it. One young man decided he didn't want to do that. Identified himself as a Christian person, and that's when the school started taking steps to punish him. Now again, one of the reasons I point that out is just down the road in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, there is a mosque. They're popping up in almost every college town in the world. By the way, you guys got a college pretty close to here, don't you? Now think about this. What would have happened if that professor had asked the person to write the word Mohammed on a piece of paper and put it on the ground and step on it? Do you think we'd get the same reaction? See, it is literally, again, open season on Christians. Why? I believe it's because what we're doing is we're trying to follow the plan that God put forth. We're the light, and darkness doesn't like the light. That's why we're starting with this topic tonight. There is no question of greater importance than whether or not God exists. To me, everything hinges on this. If there really is a God, then, again, you're here for a reason. Your life has purpose. There is no God. We're all just here by mistake. Just by random atoms coming together. Now, as you look at that, consider for just a moment only bodies that have a component that goes on after death. Only bodies that have a spirit can have meaning. Because otherwise, if you die and it's over, then your life doesn't have a whole lot of meaning. Number two, if there are no gods, then there are no endless lives. Because it takes a God to instill what? The spirit. Number three, if there is no God, by definition then, life doesn't have a meaning. Now, again, you may not like the way I laid it out, but that doesn't change the very real fact that it's very true. It's God that helps us to answer questions like, where'd I come from? Where am I going when I die? Why am I here? But not just that, if we have God in our worldview, it affects literally every aspect of our life. I mean, it affects the way we look at things like history or politics or law, everything. Folks, here's the problem. Our kids are growing up in a system in which God's been removed. Oh yeah, we bring them to church on Sunday morning, we bring them to church Sunday night, maybe Wednesday night, but you know what they're getting the rest of the time? A very godless worldview. And so as you look at that, this question should be jumping out at you. How do we ensure that in Gainesboro, Tennessee, that people are going to be moral? That our kids are going to have character? What I want to do with you for just a moment is I want to share a real quick history lesson. Now, this history lesson is actually a history lesson that has happened within the lifetime of people in this room. Okay, now, I could, in teaching this, I could go way, way back on a timeline to say 1859. Charles Darwin wrote a book, kind of jump-started the evolutionary movement. But 1859, that's a little too far back. I don't think anybody in this room, I don't think anybody was here back then. We could go to about 1925, Dayton, Tennessee. The Scopes monkey trial. Some of you may remember studying that. But again, that's really, really too far back. I don't think there's a whole lot of folks that were here back then. Maybe John. But where I want us to start is about 1950. Okay? 1950 is when the government got involved in the idea of origins, science. They formed the National Science Foundation. Those of you who were living in 1950, you may remember we were actually racing the Russians to space. Remember that? 1957, we got beat. They launched a satellite called Sputnik. And all of a sudden, there was a whole lot of fear. People wondered, what does this mean? Are they going to take over? In fact, take a look at this little section from a textbook. It says, the tide began to turn in the 1960s, in part because of the Soviet launch of the Sputnik satellite in 1957. That triumph of Soviet science created a national panic over the state of American science education, including the teaching of evolution. Textbooks began surveying evolution again. By 1967, even the Tennessee legislature had repealed the law that had gotten Scopes arrested. So here we are, we're 1957, the Russians beat us, lots of pressure to produce scientists. Just 2 years later, in 1959, President Eisenhower's advisors came to him and said, look, we've got to revamp the way we're teaching origins, science. They told him, they said, all of the advanced nations are using evolution. We got to get rid of this idea of creation and God. We got to go with evolution. And so in 1959, here's what he did. He asked Congress for $1 billion to revamp the way we teach it. Now, folks, $1 billion, that's a lot of money. But $1 billion in 1959, that was an enormous amount of money. And he got it. And watch the dominoes start to fall right after this took place. That was in 1959. By 1962, the Supreme Court decided that prayer in schools was unconstitutional. The very next year, some of you remember this, Madalyn Murray O'Hair. Remember that name? She won her famous case to kick the Bible reading out of school. So now think about that for just a moment. At the same time, we're injecting a godless theory into the science curriculum. We're taking God out. That was in 1963. By 1968, the state of Arkansas had been told, you must teach human evolution. You don't really have a choice. The very next year, our nation passed something called the no-fault divorce law. You say, no-fault divorce, what is that? No-fault divorce. Believe it or not, for those of you who are under the age of, say, 40, believe it or not, it used to be really hard to get a divorce in America. It actually took, in almost every state, a calendar year you had to wait, and one of the 3 A's: abuse, adultery, or abandonment. That was it. Otherwise, you didn't get out of your marriage. When this thing right here passed, basically they said, you know what? Somebody burns a toast, you can get a divorce. There doesn't have to be any fault. I tell young people, and I'm not really kidding, there are states of our union today, it is easier to get out of your marriage than it is to get out of your cell phone contract. Think about that. You say, Brad, why would you add that one to this whole list of the timeline? I would add that one because, folks, if you're going to bring down a nation, you don't start in Washington, you start in the home. You say, okay, I hear what you're saying, but still, what does any of this matter? Folks, listen to me. It matters because what we think about our origins dictates our behavior. You know, if I think that I'm just the fortunate mistake of countless biochemical morons, guess what? I'm going to act differently than if I think I'm created in the image of God. Abraham Lincoln made the comment, he said, the philosophy of the classroom in one generation will be the philosophy of the government in the next. Now, I put this up there because I need you to understand we have now run 2 generations through our public education system learning this godless system. And they're now in Washington. In fact, there was a similar quote by a guy by the name of Adolf Hitler who said, let me control the textbooks and I will control the state. You see, he knew that ultimately the prize was the hearts and the minds of the young people. Last year, Melissa Harris Perry, she made a comment that ought to wake up some of the parents in this room. Because she kind of echoed saying, kids belong to the community, not to their parents. Well, folks, last time I checked, God has put me responsible for raising my children, not the community. You say, okay, Brad, what have been the results? What are the results of this failed experiment, this history lesson? Well, let's take a look, okay? I'm going to use 1963 as my landmark year, and here's why. You remember Eisenhower asked for the money in 1959. Normally takes about 4 years once you ask for the money to actually get it into the textbooks. And by 1963, we had outlawed prayer and we had outlawed Bible reading. Did we get evolution in the textbooks? Oh, yeah. That's not a big secret. But folks, what happened is all of a sudden we started reaping other things. Like, for instance, the percentage of teenage girls having premarital sex has gone up in every age category since 1963. In fact, if you look at the screen for just a moment, you notice right in the middle there's an orange bar. I put that there to represent the year 1963. You'll see it on several graphs. Prior to that bar, we were still telling people, hey, there's a God. You were created in the image of God. After that, you're just the fortunate mistakes of countless biochemical morons. How about this one? Sexually transmitted diseases in children ages 10 to 14 is up 385% since 1963. 385%. Birth rates for unwed girls up 200% since 1963. You'll notice it's basically flat and then it starts shooting up. Ironically, pregnancies, as you notice at the bottom of the screen, pregnancies actually up 553%. You say, whoa, time out, Brad. How could that be? How could pregnancies be up 553%, but birth rate's only up 200%? So your math didn't jive in there. Well, that would be because in the early 1970s, our country passed Roe v. Wade. And so now a pregnancy does not equate a what? A birth. How about this one? Out-of-wedlock births, as a percentage of all births, has gone up every single year since 1963. In fact, let me wake you guys up a little bit this evening. As of the year 2000, I got to back up a few weeks, 2013, we were sitting at 43% of every child born into the United States of America is born in this situation. 43%. Now you look at me and you say, okay, yeah, Brad, we all know folks who've fallen in that position. What's the big deal? Two problems with that. Number one, God had a plan for the family unit. You remember when they're talking to him about marriage, you remember what he did? He took them all the way back to Adam and Eve. Number two, do you know what happens when you take a dad out of the home? Take a look on the screen. 63% of the young people who kill themselves, they're coming from homes without a father. 71% of high school dropouts, guess what? They're coming from homes without a dad. In fact, 85% of the young people in prison, right now as I'm talking to you, they're coming from homes without a father. I got a letter just this week, literally, from a man who is on death row here in Tennessee. Guess what he fits? He fits this bill right here. Unmarried couples living together, up 725% since 1963. You know what scares me, church? We don't even blush about this much anymore. 700, and you say, but wait a second, Brad, time out. You know, the population in Cookeville, Gainesboro has really grown, and you're right. And you guys have got every restaurant all around Cookeville that anybody'd ever want. But you see this little white line right here at the bottom? I put that there to show you where we should be if we just go by population growth alone. And yet, realistically, we're off the chart. Divorce up since 1963. Not a surprise to anybody. If you make it easy, if you pass the no-fault divorce law, guess what people are going to do? And some of you may be looking at my graph right now saying, wait, time out, Brad. Hold on, it's tapering off right there at the end. It looks like it's getting better. Okay, before you roll out the banners and start celebrating, you might want to understand the only reason our divorce rate is going down is because our young people aren't getting married. They're shacking up together. That's it. How about this one? Violent crime in the United States of America up 995% since 1963. Now, I want to make sure everybody understands something. I'm not just grabbing numbers out of thin air, okay? You'll notice at the bottom of every one of my graphs, there is a reference that you can check. Ironically, most of those references, they are coming from the same government that is now demanding we teach a godless theory. In fact, talking about violent crime, I want to show you a clipping out of the LA Times. Take a look at this one. It says, in most of Oakland Unified School District's 92 schools, the fight against crime and violence is unending. An Uzi semi-automatic rifle with 15 hollow-point bullets was among the weapons confiscated by district officials within the last year. Franklin Elementary School, trying to ensure the students know to hit the ground when bullets fly, they carry out shooting drills twice a year. Shooting drills. Okay, I'm the product of public education in Middle Tennessee. Okay, I remember fire drills. Loved them. Because that meant you got to go outside, right? You line up single file, you march outside. We had tornado drills. So I can remember as a young boy going out into the hallway, covering up. In fact, I was born at the very end of the Cold War era. And I can remember at least once, maybe twice, crawling under my desk, some of you may remember this, for a bomb drill. You remember that? Like that little desk would do anything if a bomb went off. I don't remember this right here. Suicide in young people is up 253% since 1963. In fact, it has gone from the 12th leading cause of their deaths, it now ranks a third. But again, nobody in this room should be surprised because, folks, listen to me. If you take away God, what are you taking away? You're taking away their hope. Child abuse, up 2,300%. Again, no surprise. You tell people they're animals, guess what they're going to act like? Illegal drug use, up 6,000%. In fact, here's what I'm going to do. I want to break it down for you this way. I'm going to show you the report card of the United States since we have tried to eradicate God and we have injected a godless theory. Since 1963, the United States of America has become the world leader, mind you, in violent crime, divorce rate, teenage pregnancy, illegal drug use, and we got the highest illiteracy rate of any industrial nation. Now, folks, listen to me carefully. That's not Brad's opinion. Those are the facts. In fact, let me show you a graph going the other way. Going down, that would be our SAT scores. You'll know the really sad thing, if you look carefully, we went for 18 straight years in a decline right after they instituted this policy. And some of you in your 30s and 40s are looking over here going, wait, it's coming back. When I was in high school, man, okay, before you start celebrating about those two little bumps at the end, you might want to know those are what we call calibrations, okay? What's a calibration? Oh, that's where we make the test easier because we're ashamed of how bad our kids are doing. And yet, even that realistically hasn't done a whole lot to help, has it? Folks, the best way for me to try to communicate this idea to you is simply this. If we were to go back to 1960, some of you were in high school back then. If we go back to 1960, we walk down a hallway, we open the door to one of those classrooms, we stick the head in and say, and we ask a teacher one question. What's your biggest problem? Well, what's your biggest complaint? They actually did this. You can find the survey online. Take a look at the top 2 answers. Talking, chewing gum. Now, let's say we do the same thing today. We go down here to the local high school, okay? First thing you got to realize is you don't just walk into high schools anymore, right? You got to get a visitor pass. You may have to go through metal detectors. But let's say you get in. You go down the hallway, you stick your head in a classroom, and you ask a teacher, maybe we've got good Christian educators in here today. We say, hey, what's your biggest problem? What's your biggest complaint? Anybody in this room think that talking and chewing gum are going to be the top 2 answers today? They did this survey as well. And folks, things have changed. Now, here's what I want to make sure you don't miss. If we take a 15-year-old child from 1960 and we take a 15-year-old child today, anatomically speaking, they're exactly the same, right? They're both 15-year-old kids. So here's what the church needs to be asking itself. How is it we've gone from talking and chewing gum being our biggest problem to having all kinds of crime and drugs? It's because of what we're putting in right up here. And ultimately, it's because of our attitude towards God. Folks, if you tell a generation that there is no God, we're going to reap the results. And that's why right now our nation is floating about, looks like we have absolutely no moral compass. If you got a Bible, open it up to Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2, where we find Peter. He is privileged. I love Peter. I love Peter for so many reasons. In a way, he reminds me of myself, and I'm not saying that in any way to elevate myself. He seems like a guy who occasionally would stick his foot in his mouth. He was kind of brash, but every once in a while, man, he would hit the nail on the head. Here we got Peter, having denied Christ, he has the privilege, the pleasure of preaching the first gospel sermon. And if you look through there, and I were to ask you, encapsulate, what does he really say? What is he saying to all the Jews? He's basically saying, you crucified Christ. Now, same book, Acts, flip over to chapter 17. Acts chapter 17, we find Paul this time. Again, Paul wanting to teach the truth. Take a look, starting in about verse 22, where he says, Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you're very religious, for I was passing through, considering the objects of your worship. I even found an altar with the inscription, to the unknown God. Therefore, the one whom you worship, without knowing him I proclaim to you. God who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord in heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands. Here we find Paul, he's preaching a sermon too, but you'll notice they both start in different places. You've got Peter, who basically looks at him and says, you crucified Christ. Then you got Paul over here with these intellectual men. He doesn't mention Christ yet. Because the first thing he's got to do, he's got to lay down the fact that there really is who? A God. Okay, church, here's the problem. 30 years ago, Gainesboro, Cookeville, Nashville, Tennessee, we were an Acts chapter 2 country. You go knock on somebody's door, guess what? They believed in a God. But you still had to teach them the truth about Christ. Today, we're in Acts 17. We're looking at people who don't even realize who God is. And so one of the things we've got to understand is we're growing up, our kids, among the atheists. Psalm chapter 14, verse 1, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, they have done abominable works. There is none who does good. So how do we teach the world and our own children that God really does exist? Well, think about it for just a minute. If I were to ask you, how do you prove that God is real? Like for instance, we know that matter exists today, right? Had to come from somewhere. Matter just doesn't pop into existence. So the fact that something exists today, that means something has existed forever. That means something's eternal. That's the first step to proving God. Let me share with you how I did it with an atheist. He and I were at a coffee shop in Franklin, Tennessee, just down I-40. We were talking together. He looked at me, and I looked at him, and I said, look, I really, really want to understand your worldview, how you believe all this stuff. So help me to understand. What was going on? He said, Brad, clear your mind of everything. I said, all right. He said, that's what was here. He said, that's what was here before the Big Bang. He said, Brad, there was literally just nothingness. I said, okay. Then what went bang? This guy looks at me across the table and says, well, the nothing went bang. I said, all right, wait a second. You expect me to believe there was nothing, literally nothing, and then on some random day, like a Thursday, at 2 o'clock, that nothing went boom, and we got all of this. He said, uh-huh. I smiled at him. I said, buddy, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, because that would take more faith than believing in God. So he kind of crossed his arms, looks at me, says, all right, what's your best proof that there's a God? So, took off my shoe. I dropped it on the table. I said, there you go, right there. There's your proof. He looked at me kind of like you guys are. He said, how in the world is your shoe proof that there's a God? I said, would you agree that my shoe exists? He made some ugly comment about, yeah, we can smell it. I said, okay. I said, my shoe could have only come from one of three places. I said, either my shoe is eternal, meaning it's been here forever and will forever be here. Or maybe option number two, maybe I was like walking down the sidewalk in sock feet and then boom, all of a sudden out of nowhere, size 11 and a half. Or option number three, my shoe was created. He looked at me, he laughed, he said, well, we can look at your shoe and know it's not eternal because it's wearing out. I said, you're right. He said, I'm not gullible enough to think that it's number two. He said, obviously your shoe was created. I said, you're absolutely right. Now, let's talk about the shoemaker. Was the shoemaker eternal? Did he pop into existence from nothing, or was he created? And all of a sudden, I watched a man who had been espousing atheism his entire life. I watched the blood drain from his face, because he realized he was basing his whole existence on option number two. You see, when you really look at it, we can prove that God exists. We know something exists today. Thus, something must be eternal, because you don't get something from nothing. Number two, something is eternal, therefore it violates scientific laws. It's not wearing out, it's not running down. Number three, something violates scientific laws, thus it exists outside of the observable laws of naturalistic science. Now, again, you may not like that kind of a mathematical thinking, but that doesn't change the fact that because there is stuff here today, it demands that something has been here forever. So what I want to do for just a couple minutes of your time is I want us to talk about how do we really prove this? How do we prove that God is real? If you were an atheist, now please understand, I'm not talking about the person behind you, beside you. How would you convince me? Let's say I walked in, I say, hey, the sign outside says Church of Christ. You got 15 minutes to prove to me that there really is a God. Parents, listen to me. If you're sitting here thinking to yourself, well, I go get the preacher, the elders, and you can't do it, then your kid certainly can't do it. How do we prove? Because we look around, I grabbed this off of an atheistic website. I guarantee you they're trying to get our kids. This is an evangelistic outreach. They say, no God, no guilt. The belief in God awakens fanaticism and guilt. Live free and responsible. Debaptize yourself. Which I told people, I guess that involves a hairdryer. I don't know. Never seen anybody debaptized. But think about it for just a minute. If I were to ask you, could you prove that Abraham Lincoln lived? To my knowledge, nobody in this room actually saw him. Or for those of you who have never been overseas, how do you know for sure that there really is a Great Wall of China? You say, well, Brad, we got evidence. I mean, think about it. We got Abraham Lincoln's childhood home up in Kentucky. We got pictures of him. We got his writings. And as far as the Great Wall of China, folks, you put me on a computer that has internet access, and within 2 minutes I can be looking at it from a satellite. Okay, but what about God? We said earlier that God is a spirit, right? So we can't measure him with those same five senses. So how do we prove to our children that there really is a God? I'm going to give you very quickly 3 arguments that I hope you'll either write down, that you'll kind of tuck away in the back of your mind, and we're going to talk about a couple of easy proofs, things that you can kind of tuck away, say, yeah, okay, you've never seen him, but have you thought about this? First one, the cosmological argument. The second one, the anthropological argument. Don't let the big word throw you. It simply means morals. Number 3, the teleological argument. That is design. If I were going to teach my own children, I've got 4 of them, they are with me tonight, and I know at some point they may look at me and say, you know, Dad, every weekend you're talking about God, but I've never seen him. Here's what I would do. I would walk them outside, point up to the night sky, and simply say, do you see all that stuff? Where did it come from? Because my kids are smart enough to see the stars. They can see the moon. In fact, tonight, perfect night to walk out. You see the moon. We know it exists. The question is, where did it come from? Okay? Go back to my shoe for just a moment. Remember the 3 possibilities? Possibility number 1, the universe is eternal. Possibility number 2, it popped into existence from nothing. Or number 3, it was created. Let's look at each one very quickly. Number 1, we know, is unscientific. And the reason that I can say that is because we know the universe is actually expanding. It had a beginning. The 2 guys that proved that conclusively, Edwin Hubble and Albert Einstein. In fact, evolutionists will even admit, this is a quote from Robert Jastrow, he said, modern science denies an eternal existence to the universe, either in the past or the future. They know that the universe is not eternal. It had a beginning. So we got to throw that option out. That only leaves you with 2. Meaning it either popped into existence from nothing or it was created. Now, if you're an atheist, you don't like option number 3. So they've got to be stuck with this one, that it popped into existence from nothing. In fact, a guy by the name of Alan Guth was giving an interview in Omni magazine. They asked him, they said, how big was this very early pre-inflation or pre-Big Bang universe? Look at how he answers the question. He says, amazingly small, about 10 to the minus 24 centimeters across, smaller, he says, than a proton. Also amazing, it would have contained only about 25 pounds of matter. Okay, so this scientist is saying everything in the universe came from 25 pounds. Two problems with that. Number one, there's a whole lot more than 25 pounds of matter just in this room. Number two, where'd that 25 pounds come from? See, he didn't actually explain the existence of the universe. All he did was shrink it down to 25 pounds, blow some smoke in your face, and hope you didn't see through it. The only option that makes logical sense is that this universe was created. So if you want to prove that there's a God, first thing you do, you walk outside and you say, where did all that stuff come from? NASA astronomer John O'Keefe, he put it this way. He said, we are by astronomical standards a pampered, a cosseted, cherished group of creatures. He said, if the universe had not been made with the most exacting precision, we could have never come into existence. He says, it is my view that these circumstances indicate the universe was created for man to live in. So that's the first way. Second way, morals. Believe it or not, even an atheist believes in morals. And the reason that I can say that with confidence, I've had the opportunity to either study or email back and forth dialogue with several atheists, and I always try to ask them this one question. Would you mind if I come to your house, rob you blind, kill your family? And believe it or not, all the atheists say the same thing. They don't want me doing that. Because they view that as wrong. In fact, if you look at this list, I think most everybody in this room, as you look at all of those different things, we categorize that as wrong. But folks, in order for something to be wrong, that means there has to be a standard. Where did we get our standard from? This time we only have two options. Option one, we got our standard from God, or we get it from man. If you're an atheist, how many options do you have? You only have one. And that is, atheists have to contend that, yes, ethics exists. I don't want you killing my family, but man evolved ethics. What's the problem with that? Who gets to decide? We're going to let Hitler decide right and wrong? Stalin, Nero? Maybe we'll let the imam in the mosque decide what is right and wrong. Or, what about this? Just in this room, let's say we let all the teenagers for the next week decide all the rules in the house. You see, if there's not an absolute standard, everything gets a little crazy. Let me give it to you in a way maybe that you can remember. Let's say that John and I are both here about a job, okay? It's a job testing hammocks 8 hours a day. Pays $500,000. All we got to do for 8 hours a day is lay in a hammock. Now, we both want the job, okay? I find out on Monday he's got an interview at 11 o'clock. I got an interview at 11:30. And I'm worried because I know he's probably had a whole lot more experience than I have. So what do? About 10 o'clock, I go slit all of his tires. He misses his interview. I make the interview. I get the job. What's the problem? The problem is right now all of you guys are thinking, well, that would be wrong. Folks, if it's evolution, survival of the fittest, I got the job. What would be wrong with that? If we allow man to make up what's right and wrong, everybody would see right and wrong a little bit differently. The only option that makes logical sense is that man has adopted God's unchanging standard. Interesting, you look through the Bible, you know what you find? You find all the different characteristics of God. He doesn't change. He's immutable. He is forever consistent. He's eternal, holy, just, and righteous. In fact, whatever he commands, approves, or does, ultimately is for our good. So the second way in which we prove that there really is a God is simply by the existence of ethics. The last would be design. If I asked you tonight, do we see design in the universe? Do we see design in the human body? Yeah, you don't get design without a what? Without a designer. Now, think about that for just a moment. I'm not a math guy. Don't really care that much for numbers. I had to have calculus to get to medical school, but I'm done, okay? Me and God, we have an understanding. I took all I was going to take. Now I'm done. But if we were to look at, for instance, the statistical odds of having a planet just in the right location, the right rotation, the makeup of the earth, all of these different aspects, take a look at the numbers. The odds of having a heavenly body in just the right type of galaxy is 1 in 7. We know that we're in a spiral galaxy, the Earth is, or our solar system. But not just that, you got to be in the right location within that galaxy. You know, not too far out on one of those spiral arms, not too close to the center. The odds of that, about 0.05 to the 5th billion. The odds of being near the right sun, that is one that's not flaming up or flaring out, it's about 1 in 100. The odds of being the right distance from that sun, about 1 in 40. You also then have to have the right rotation rate, the right tilt. You add all those numbers up. The number you see at the bottom of the screen, that's the statistical odds of having a heavenly body in just the right place in space. And yet, here's the funny thing, you still don't have life yet. Because in order to have life, you still got to have things like water, right? And think about it. Where'd the water come from? While we're talking about that, son, consider for just a moment that the sun's about, 93 million miles away? 93 million. Do you realize in almost every church family that I go to, there is a fight going on. We don't like to talk about it much in the church. We don't like to air out our dirty laundry. But I imagine even in this church family, it's probably going on. And that fight has to do with a little box that's usually on the wall somewhere. And some poor deacon usually is responsible for pressing the buttons on that box, raising it up or down. And he can do one of two things. He can make the ladies happy and all of us men are sweating, or he can make the men happy and the ladies are freezing. Now, folks, we can't even agree to the temp in our own auditoriums, and yet God set the temperature for the sun 93 million miles away, perfect for life on earth. You see, when you look at all of this, are we really to think that all of that got placed there by chance? The reality is this. There is a God. We can prove He exists. Folks, if we don't start waking up our community and reminding our friends and neighbors, guess what our society is going to continue to do? In fact, I will leave you. I'm going to leave you with this last thought before I open it up for your questions. In the last few months, I've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of people who've left the church. Those of you who get Think, you may remember the December issue of Think magazine, we gave the survey results. Over 700 people who had left the church. I've talked to them. I've emailed people. I've counseled with them. I've sat with their parents crying. Interestingly, there's a single common thread that is running between everybody that I've met who've left the church. And that is, they have absolutely no fear of the Lord. Think about that. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of, and yet we're not teaching it anymore. Folks, until you understand He exists and until you're willing to humble your knee and bow before Him, you don't have a foundation to build on. I'll leave you right there. I've gone a little over. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open it up for your comments, your questions. The way I usually do this, for those of you who were here several years ago, you may remember, you just raise your hand. I'll call on you. I'll do my best to repeat the question over my microphone so that everybody can hear it, I'm actually going to open my computer and record it just because I like to have a copy of the question and answer session. Pretty much anything is fair game. I will let you guys have the floor. Questions, comments? And by the way, if you don't ask me questions, I get to ask you questions. Yes, sir. Okay, good question. So are there any groups out there who are lobbying the other way? And the answer is absolutely. And we are making some progress in isolated places. I'll give you an example. Wilson County is just down the road. Year and a half, 2 years ago, they were able to actually get the Bible into some of their selective classrooms because they're teaching it as history. And so that's good. It's not great. It's not an all, wonderful answer. But for kids who take that elective, they get to learn the Bible as history. There are groups out there who are, like, for instance, everybody in here's probably heard of the ACLU. There's a group that actually kind of combats everything the ACLU does called the ACLJ, the American Center for Law and Justice. They are fighting very, very hard. Every time somebody you read in the paper, hey, they want them to take down this cross, or they want them to stop doing this. The ACLJ is actually the group that is trying very, very hard to put the brakes on that and to say, wait a second, that's not what the Founding Fathers really meant with the idea of separation of church and state. What they actually meant was the government was not to interfere with the practice of a Christian religion. They didn't mean we're supposed to hide everything that has to do with Christianity. What else? Let me throw this out because he asked the question. We are making some little advances here and there. The thing that bothers me a little bit right now, this year, 2014, is I'm watching Common Core being implemented all across the country. Right now, I think it is 46 or 44 states have taken the money, the race to the top money, that is tied to accepting Common Core. Okay, Common Core sounds like a great thing. If my child is in mathematics 7th grade in California, then 7th grade math there should be equal to 7th grade math in Tennessee. Sounds like a good thing. But when you start turning it over to things like science and history, all of a sudden we got big problems because the question is, number one, who gets to determine the core? And number two, somebody help me understand, why are we putting so much emphasis in things like Islam, humanism, atheism in this Common Core? The other thing, anybody in this room that has more than one child, do all children learn the same way? Do all children learn at the same rate? And yet what this is trying to be is a single Band-Aid approach for everybody, and I don't think it's going to be a good thing for our country. Good question. Other comments, questions, thoughts? Oh, you guys are quiet. What other changes have you seen, especially those of you who are older, since when you were in school? Yes, sir.
One of the things that has really bothered me, and I think you've corrected a lot of my thinking tonight, but as I said, like you said about homosexuality, when that word is mentioned, or I see somebody that's really into that, I just get so disgusted that I can't talk to them or do anything.
What we got to remember, a couple of things. Number one, we got to remember they do have a soul, and so we've got to reach out to anybody. The second thing we got to understand, and this is where I think my generation and above, we don't have a clue of how much our kids have already been taught tolerance. I was in Clarksville, Tennessee, not too long ago. I was teaching. The elders had asked me, they said, on Saturday, will you have just an informal discussion with our kids? Just an informal Q&A session. I said, sure. So picture in your mind, they have an auditorium kind of similar to this. They were all sitting right over here, about 5 rows deep. And we started. And it was good. By the third question, we hit the topic of homosexuality. One of the kids asked a question. I answered it. Pretty plain, simple, boom, here's what the Bible says. I get done with my answer. The girl looks at me and she says, I hear what you're saying, but I just don't have a problem with it. Next question, same topic. So this time I thought, all right, obviously I didn't teach it well enough. I'm going to start in Genesis and walk these kids through. So I said, look, let's see if God's attitude has changed. We looked at it in Genesis all the way through to the New Testament. Young lady says, I hear what you're saying about it being a sin, but I don't have a problem with it. Next question. I kid you not, we went about 4 questions deep. Here's the funny thing, or not funny thing. All the kids are over here. Some of the parents, some of the youth leaders and things had gathered while we were doing this. They were sitting over here just quiet listening. I turned and looked, and all the parents were doing this. And I said, don't be that surprised. They've been taught tolerance since they were in 1st and 2nd grade. I said, these kids actually think I'm the bad guy because I'm showing them what the Bible says. And that's where we are today.
I have one other thing.
Yeah.
When I first started teaching one-on-one, I'd go in someone's home. I always said when we, ask questions, we'd start, and I'd say, okay, this is what the Bible says. But if we can't agree that the Bible is the standard,
Yep.
see, I've had a problem, and
Yes.
still has a problem.
Yes. Let me point out something that he said that everybody in this room needs to hear. He said when he started out going into people's homes one-on-one, church, if we're ever going to grow, we got to get back to that. I travel all over the United States of America, and for some reason, we have this mentality that if we build a nice building and maybe we send out some flyers, the people are going to come to us. That has never been the way the Bible says. The Bible's always said it's going to be one-on-one personal evangelism that teaches people the truth. But he said he has a problem, and that is if you do not establish the authority of the Bible, all you're doing is exchanging opinions. And they'll tell you, you'll hit some point that they disagree, and they'll say, well, I don't think that. Or, the Bible says that, but I think blah, blah, blah. So one of the very first things you have to do in teaching and communicating and Bible study with somebody is you got to lay down, you know what, it doesn't matter what you think, what I think, what your grandma thinks, what your mom thinks. It matters what this book says because this is the authority, and you probably are going to have to spend at least 1 or 2 lessons establishing the inspiration of the Bible. Because we got a lot of people in this community who think, well, it's a good book. Well, it's more than a good book. Yes, ma'am. They have their own Bible. Oh, wow. Okay. She said they have their own Bible, and they talked about they were in Books A Million and flipping through it, and their Bible doesn't look like our Bible, which makes it even harder because then you may have to spend a few minutes talking about is there a difference between a translation and a paraphrase? In other words, if we look at the King James or the New King James version of the Bible, is that different than, say, the Message where people just wrote out what they thought the writers were saying? Yeah, there's a whole lot of difference there. And so you're right, that is frustrating. That takes it to a whole nother level, because they may have something in front of you. It says Bible on it, but that verse doesn't say what you're saying. What I would probably do in that situation, if it were me, is I would say, okay, your verse right here doesn't say that. What we're going to do, we're going to write that down. Let's say it's on baptism. We're going to write that down. We're going to keep studying, and we're going to see if there are any other places in the Bible that talk about baptism, being buried with Christ, whatever, that might shed more light on this verse to make us think maybe your passage right here was not translated properly. And I would throw everything at the kitchen sink and make sure that they got the picture. Because, folks, that's the beauty of the gospel. Man, he put it out there so plainly in so many ways, so many different books. We've got it. We just got to make sure that we can communicate it. Other thoughts, comments? That's a good point. Oh, wow, yeah. He said the New International Version has confused a lot of people. He's right.
We just want to feel good. We don't want any bad vibes. That's why we read them.
Yeah. Let me, I have 4 kids. I'm going to come back and touch on the NIV. There are a lot of people, a lot of parents who justify, I'm going to give it to my kids because it's easy to read. And I understand that, and that's better than them reading some kind of a trashy novel. I carry with me, when I preach, I carry a New King James Version. I do that for multiple reasons. One, because I can go from the Carolinas to California, and everybody is pretty familiar with what it's saying in there. It's based, obviously, off of the King James, which is kind of the standard. It's easy enough that my 8-year-old can understand it. So I find the whole, well, they need something easy to read. That, to me, they need something that they can stick with their entire life, because here's the thing. When I started reading and memorizing and studying the Bible, I had a King James Dixon version of the Bible. And man, that's what I learned from and memorized from. Same thing with our kids. They're sponges. They're going to start memorizing things early. So put something in their hands that they can keep with them all their life. He mentioned we like to have things that are easy, warm, and fuzzy. I'm afraid that kind of preaching and teaching is killing the church. We're going to have to get back to some good old-fashioned hellfire and brimstone, reminding people what sin is. One of the reasons we're not converting people is because they're not really convicted in their heart. In order to be converted, you have to have godly sorrow. In order to have godly sorrow, guess what? Somebody's going to have to stand up here and remind them that not everything is hunky-dory in their life. Good point. Yes? That's a good point, too. He said people are convinced, but they're not converted. You've got a lot of people in America convinced that God's real. But are they actually converted to do His will? No. Other thoughts, comments? You guys are quiet. Yes, sir. Someone like... What would I say to somebody who is convinced but not truly converted? You going to be here Sunday? Because you're going to get a large dose of it Sunday. To me, Jesus talked about that kind of a person a lot. And, you know, I think at some point we've got to start going back and asking people, have you counted the cost? I've taught, and I'm not going to say this Sunday, so I'll throw this out there. I've taught a lot of people that I think one of the areas that we messed up in the church is we have taught baptism almost like a flu shot. And by that I mean young people, they get in the water and they think, okay, I'm good, I'm covered. Okay? That's not when it's over. That's really when it starts. And Jesus, in Matthew chapter 7, talked about the fact that in order to get to the narrow gate, you had to be on the narrow or difficult path. And I think what we're doing is we're having people that get wet, they come up, and guess what? They never get on the narrow path. They go right back out on the broad way. And so we've got to get back to teaching people, look, baptism is essential. It is a part. But it is a part. There's more to it. And if you're living your life for yourself, you're not truly a servant of Jesus Christ. But I be here Sunday. You'll get a double dose of that. Yes, sir. That's right. Yep. What scares me, church, is, and I'm going to step on your toes gently tonight. What scares me is we have a lot of Christians who have lulled themselves into a state of apathy. We're comfortable. Okay, the church is not going to grow if we're comfortable. And I don't think Jesus Christ, somebody show me a verse, if it's in the Bible, I'd like to read it. I don't read him saying part of being a Christian is you being comfortable. In fact, I read just the opposite. I read that we're going to be persecuted, that we're going to have trials. And so at some point, if we're really going to get past this thing, if we're going to turn things around, what we have to do is say to ourselves, I need to be at church Sunday morning and Sunday night and Wednesday night, but that's only a very small fraction of what I need to be doing. I need to be out here reaching people and communicating and teaching and talking. And that takes getting out of your comfort zones and getting out of our boxes. But that's what we've got to get back to doing. This gentleman mentioned being in people's homes. I was not of the generation that went into people's homes and watched film strips. I wish I was, in all honesty. Because I've been told stories about how people were literally converted by the dozens by watching the film strip. And different people can remember. They tell me, I was the one, I was the kid that turned it every time there was the ding. That's what I did. And we were in people's houses. We don't do that anymore. And I'm not saying everybody in this room needs to go grab a film projector, but I am saying we do need to be talking to our coworkers and our friends and our extended family and our neighbors because they're lost. Any other thoughts, questions, comments? Tomorrow night, we start at 6:30, right? Okay. I want you to do 2 favors for me, okay? Number 1, unless there's like 7 inches of snow, plan on being back at 6:30, okay? If there's 6.5, you need to just put chains on. Sorry. Plan on being back 6:30 tomorrow night. And number 2, in the next 24 hours, do me a favor. This is one act that you can do to show you're not going to be apathetic anymore. In the next 24 hours, call somebody. Text one person, email some person, get on the phone. Just one person, ask them to be sitting beside you tomorrow night. Because, folks, we can fill this place up. We're going to look at some good strengthening material that I think it would help this entire community. I really do hope you'll be back. I also hope as you're leaving tonight, grab a copy of Think Magazine. They are free. We don't want to take them back. We'd rather them be in your homes. We'd rather you share them with your family and friends. It's a monthly magazine that we put out, written by faithful Christians. They're on the back table in the back. Appreciate very, very much y'all's attention tonight.